Brutal punishment for Enzo Fernandez after returning to England. And I am not exaggerating. What awaits the Argentine at Stamford Bridge could become one of the most dramatic situations a Premier League footballer has faced in years. In this video, I am going to tell you exactly what is happening, the money involved, the Manchester City offer, the anger surrounding his actions with Argentina, and most importantly, what has reportedly happened inside Chelsea since Enzo Fernandez returned to England. Because this is no longer just a transfer story. It has become a story about trust, loyalty, respect, and a relationship between a player and a club that appears to be completely broken. And if you stay until the end, you will understand why this situation has become so explosive. Let's start with the offer that changed everything. According to reports from ESPN, Manchester City have put around €145 million on the table for Enzo Fernandez. €145 million. That is the number Chelsea are now having to consider. And remember, Chelsea paid €121 million to sign Enzo from Benfica in January 2023. He arrived as one of the biggest investments in the club's history, a young World Cup winner who had just been named the best young player at the Qatar World Cup. Chelsea believed they were signing the midfielder who could become one of the foundations of their future. But now, just over 3 years later, the situation could not be more different. Enzo reportedly wants to leave Chelsea and move to Manchester City, where he could reunite with Maresca, the coach who previously worked with him at Stamford Bridge. And that is where the story becomes much more complicated, because for Chelsea supporters, this is not simply a player asking for a transfer. It feels like a player who was given enormous trust, enormous money, and enormous responsibility is now turning around and asking to join a direct Premier League rival. And that is only the beginning. Now we have to go back to the World Cup, because that is where much of the anger surrounding Enzo began. July 2026. Argentina against England. A World Cup semi-final filled with history, emotion, rivalry, Maradona, the Falklands conflict, Beckham's red card in 1998, Messi, and everything that has made Argentina versus England one of football's most emotionally charged matchups. Argentina won 2-1 and reached the World Cup final. Losing a semi-final is painful for any country, but that is football. England could accept the result. What came afterward was far more controversial. After the final whistle, Enzo Fernandez and several Argentine teammates reportedly displayed a banner referring to the Falkland Islands as Argentine territory. For Argentina, the islands are known as the Malvinas. For Britain, they are the Falkland Islands, and the 1982 war remains a deeply emotional part of the country's history. That is why the image caused such a powerful reaction in England. Enzo was not simply an Argentine footballer celebrating with his national team. He was also a Chelsea player who lives and works in England, earns a huge salary from an English club, and plays in the Premier League. To many English supporters, displaying that message immediately after eliminating England from the World Cup felt deliberately provocative. Social media exploded. Calls for Enzo to leave Chelsea spread rapidly, and criticism came from supporters and former players. The argument from his defenders was simple. Enzo is Argentine, and he has the right to express his national identity. But his critics made a different argument. They said that there is a difference between holding a political or patriotic opinion and deliberately displaying a provocative message in front of an audience of millions immediately after defeating England. And that distinction is at the heart of this entire controversy. Because when Enzo returned to London after the World Cup, the atmosphere around him was reportedly very different. Instead of receiving a normal welcome back, he reportedly faced a wall of tension. And this is where the story moves from the stands into the Chelsea dressing room. While Enzo was returning to England, reports claimed that his representatives had already been in contact with Manchester City. According to the reports surrounding the situation, discussions had been taking place before the World Cup. That means Enzo's future may already have been under consideration before the controversy in the semi-final. And if that is true, Chelsea were not simply dealing with a player returning from international duty. They were dealing with a player who was already considering an exit. Then came the reported €145 million proposal from Manchester City. Suddenly, everything made sense from Chelsea's perspective. Their record signing wanted to leave, and he wanted to join a direct Premier League rival. Even more significantly, the potential destination was Manchester City, where Maresca was reportedly interested in bringing him into his project. Maresca had previously worked at Chelsea and knew the club, its players, its methods, and its structure. Now he could potentially take one of Chelsea's most expensive players with him. From Chelsea's point of view, that would be a difficult pill to swallow. Imagine spending €121 million on a player, building your midfield around him, paying him a huge salary, and then watching him ask to join one of your biggest rivals. That is why this situation feels personal to so many Chelsea supporters. But then there is the dressing room. According to claims circulating around the club, when Enzo returned to the training ground at Cobham, the atmosphere was extremely uncomfortable. There were reportedly no dramatic fights or screaming matches. Instead, the story describes something much colder. Distance. Silence. A lack of communication. The idea that teammates were keeping their distance from him. Whether every detail of those reports is accurate is difficult to establish, but the wider tension is understandable. Chelsea have English players who grew up surrounded by the history and emotions of English football. They saw the same World Cup celebration that millions of people in England saw. If they felt offended by it, the consequences inside the dressing room were always going to be difficult to avoid. And for a footballer, that kind of isolation can be devastating. You can argue with a manager. You can negotiate with directors. You can hire lawyers and agents. But you cannot easily fix a broken relationship with an entire dressing room. Now let's talk about the money, because this is where Chelsea supporters have another reason to be angry. Chelsea paid €121 million for Enzo in January 2023. He was one of the most expensive signings in the club's history. The expectation was enormous. He was supposed to become a central figure in the club's rebuild and eventually one of the best midfielders in the world. He has certainly produced excellent performances and important moments, but his time at Chelsea has also been inconsistent. There have been periods when he looked outstanding and others when supporters questioned whether he was delivering the level expected from a player with such a massive price tag. Now imagine Chelsea selling him for €145 million. On paper, that looks like a €24 million profit compared with the original transfer fee. But football transfers are never that simple. There are salaries, bonuses, agent fees, and other costs involved. Once all of those expenses are considered, Chelsea's overall investment in Enzo is much higher than the original €121 million transfer fee. That is why the financial picture is more complicated than simply saying Chelsea make €24 million. And there is another problem. If Chelsea sell Enzo to Manchester City, they could be strengthening a direct Premier League rival with a midfielder they spent years developing and millions of euros acquiring. Chelsea would receive a huge transfer fee, but City could potentially receive a player capable of improving their midfield. So what should Chelsea do? Sell for €145 million and move on, or keep a player who reportedly no longer wants to stay? Neither option is comfortable. And then there is the Maresca factor. This is one of the most intriguing parts of the entire story. Maresca knows Enzo. He worked with him at Chelsea and understands his qualities. If Manchester City really are pursuing Enzo, it would make sense that a coach familiar with the player could see him as an ideal addition. But from Chelsea's perspective, that makes the situation even more uncomfortable. Their former coach could potentially leave and then return for one of their most valuable players. Some people around the club may wonder whether this possibility had been discussed before Maresca's departure. Was the move planned? Was Enzo already considering City? Or is this simply the normal process of a major player attracting interest from another club? Those are questions that only the people directly involved can truly answer. But the suspicion alone has made the situation more explosive. And now we reach the part that could define Enzo's future at Chelsea. Reports surrounding the situation suggest that the club have considered separating him from the main group while his future is being resolved. If that happens, Enzo could find himself training away from the first team, potentially with younger players or on a separate schedule. For a footballer earning millions every year, that would be a brutal message. It would mean that the club are effectively saying, "You are still under contract, but you are no longer part of our sporting plans." And then there is the question of his shirt number. If a club takes a player's number away and gives it to somebody else, the message is obvious. It is no longer about simply finding a transfer. It means the club are preparing for life without that player. But perhaps the biggest issue is what Enzo has or has not said publicly. There has been criticism over the lack of a major public apology to Chelsea supporters for the Falklands-related controversy. For critics, silence makes the situation worse. They wanted Enzo to explain himself, acknowledge the anger, and show that he understood why people were offended. Instead, the lack of a clear public response has allowed the controversy to continue growing. And this is not the first controversy involving Enzo. In 2024, he faced criticism after a video from Argentina's celebrations included a song containing offensive and racist references toward French players. FIFA investigated the incident, Chelsea condemned discriminatory behavior, and Enzo apologized. That controversy eventually passed, but it remains part of the background whenever his actions with Argentina are discussed. For his critics, the latest incident therefore feels less like an isolated mistake and more like another moment in which the player's international identity has collided with his professional life in England. And that is why some Chelsea supporters have reached a breaking point. They do not simply see a player who wants a transfer. They see a player who they believe has repeatedly created controversy and is now asking to leave for a direct rival. Meanwhile, Chelsea have another deadline approaching: the transfer window. With the window closing on September 1st, the club cannot allow the situation to remain unresolved forever. They have to make a decision. Either the transfer is completed, or Enzo remains at Chelsea and the club must decide how to handle a player who reportedly wants to leave. If they sell him, they risk strengthening Manchester City. This is the nightmare scenario for the club. And now there is another reported condition that could make the negotiations even more interesting. According to claims surrounding the situation, Chelsea could seek restrictions on Enzo facing them immediately after a transfer to City. In other words, they could want some form of protection against the player immediately returning to Stamford Bridge in another shirt. Whether such a condition would actually be accepted is another matter, but the idea shows just how emotionally charged the situation has become. Imagine Enzo leaving Chelsea for Manchester City and then walking back into Stamford Bridge wearing City's colors. Imagine the reception. Imagine thousands of Chelsea supporters remembering the World Cup controversy, the transfer saga, and everything that happened before his departure. It would be one of the most hostile returns imaginable. And that brings us to the biggest question: what should Chelsea actually do? If Manchester City really are prepared to pay €145 million, should Chelsea take the money? Financially, there is a strong argument for accepting it. The club would receive a huge fee and could reinvest that money into several positions. They could sign players who genuinely want to be part of the project. But there is also a sporting argument against it. Why would Chelsea willingly give one of their midfielders to a direct rival? Why help Manchester City improve? Why allow a player who has reportedly created such tension to leave and potentially become a star somewhere else? On the other hand, keeping him could create an even bigger problem. If Enzo does not want to be at Chelsea, his value could fall. His relationship with the supporters could become toxic. The dressing room could remain uncomfortable. And Chelsea would continue paying his enormous salary. So there is no perfect solution. Every option carries a risk. And this is what makes the Enzo Fernandez story so fascinating. It started with a young World Cup winner arriving at Chelsea for €121 million, expected to become one of the central figures of a new era. Now the same player could be leaving for €145 million, potentially joining a direct rival, while carrying the baggage of a major international controversy. That is an extraordinary transformation. But before we finish, I want you to put yourself in Enzo's position for a moment. You are 25 years old. You are a World Cup champion. You have talent, money, fame, and the potential to become one of the best midfielders in the world. Yet your relationship with your club appears to be collapsing. Supporters who once celebrated your name are now demanding that you leave. Your future is being discussed in every football conversation. And the club that invested €121 million in you may now be considering cutting you out of the first-team picture. How does a player get from being one of the club's biggest hopes to becoming the center of such a bitter controversy? Sometimes it happens through one huge mistake. Sometimes it happens through a series of decisions that gradually destroy trust. And in Enzo's case, the combination of the World Cup controversy, the reported transfer negotiations, and the possibility of joining Manchester City has created the perfect storm. Whether every allegation surrounding the situation proves true remains to be seen. But the damage to his relationship with parts of the Chelsea fanbase is already obvious. So now we reach the final question. Does Enzo Fernandez deserve another chance at Chelsea? Should the club forgive him, bring him back into the first team, and try to rebuild the relationship? Or has the situation gone too far? Should Chelsea accept the €145 million from Manchester City and close this chapter once and for all? Or should they refuse to sell to a direct rival, even if that means keeping a player who does not want to stay? And what about the World Cup banner? Was it patriotic expression? Or was it an unnecessary provocation at exactly the worst possible moment? I want to know what you think, because this story is no longer simply about a football transfer. It is about loyalty, identity, respect, money, and what happens when a relationship between a player and a club completely breaks down. If Enzo Fernandez does leave Chelsea, his next return to Stamford Bridge could be unforgettable. The question is not whether the supporters will remember him. They will. The question is what they will remember him for. A brilliant midfielder who helped shape Chelsea's future, or a player whose final chapter became synonymous with controversy and betrayal? Tell me in the comments. Should Chelsea accept €145 million from Manchester City? Or should they refuse and keep Enzo away from the rival? Should Enzo get one final chance? Or is it time for Chelsea to move on? And most importantly, what did you make of the Falklands controversy? Was it patriotic pride? Or was it the biggest mistake of Enzo Fernandez's career? I want to hear your opinion.